Hi, my name is Katherine Hayhoe. I'm a climate scientist. Studying science is a privilege for any of us. If we view this incredible universe we live in as God's creation, then what is science, other than trying to figure out how God set this all up in the first place? And when I was first studying astrophysics, that's what my undergraduate degree is in, I viewed it as studying what my dad, a science educator and also an amateur astronomer, referred to as God's art gallery growing up. But it was a class that I took, a breadth requirement, I thought, to finish my degree that changed the trajectory of my life. I took a class on climate change. And there I learned that climate change is not only an environmental issue that environmentalists care about, environmentalists work on, and the rest of us might wish them well or watch their documentaries. Climate change is a human issue. Climate change affects every aspect of our lives on this planet. And climate change is, as the U.S. military now calls it, a threat multiplier. It takes every challenge that we're facing today, including poverty, hunger, injustice, inequity, and more, and makes it worse. In fact, if we leave climate change out of the picture, there's no way that we can fix any of the challenges that so many of us are working on in this world today. So that's when I decided to become a climate scientist, when I realized that climate change affects us all, but it disproportionately affects the poorest and most marginalized people right here in North America as well as on the other side of the world, the very ones that we are told to care for and love. Let's start at the very beginning. The three questions I'm often asked are these. First of all, is climate changing? Second of all, how do we know that humans are responsible? And then third, why would it matter to us if we're Christians? Our human brains are built to remember weather. We think of that crazy hot day or that heat wave, and people say, oh, that must be global warming. And then we have a cold wave, and people say, well, where's global warming now? But weather, what our brains remember, is like a single tree. It's what happens on a certain place on a certain day on a certain week of the year. Climate is the average statistics of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. Climate is the forest. And our brains are not built to remember climate. We would have to add up the temperature on every day of the year for at least 20 or 30 years and fit a trend line through it, and then do that all around the whole world to really understand if the planet was warming. Well, we can't do that with our brains alone, but we can do that with a computer. And when we do that, we see that yes, indeed, the planet is warming over climate timescales. From year to year, global average temperature goes up and down, but decade by decade by decade, it is ticking steadily upwards. We don't need to depend on thermometers or scientific instruments to measure temperature change, though. When we look around the entire world at the date that trees and plants are blooming, at glaciers melting, at sea level rising, at invasive species moving poleward. Around the world, there are 26,500 independent lines of evidence in God's creation telling us that, yes, the planet is warming. Many people would agree today because we see the weather's getting weirder no matter where we live. But often people will say, sure, things might be different, they might be changing, but hasn't it always been that way? We know that climate has changed in the past, and you know how we know? It's because climate scientists study it. We are the ones who study past changes in climate for natural reasons, as well as present and future changes. And so when we see climate changing, we don't automatically jump on the bandwagon and assume it has to be humans. No, what we do and what we have done is we check all the natural factors first. Could it be the sun or natural cycles or volcanoes that are causing our planet to warm today? And here's what we see when we look at those natural factors. First of all, could it be the sun? Well, over time, the sun's energy increases or decreases chaotically. And when it increases a little bit, we get a bit warmer usually, and when it decreases, we get slightly cooler. So has the sun's energy increased in recent decades? No. It's been going down since the 1970s. So in fact, if the sun were the primary factor controlling our climate today, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. It can't be the sun. The sun has an alibi. What about natural cycles? We know that natural cycles exist. We, again, climate scientists, are the ones who study them. And we also know how natural cycles work. Natural cycles like El Nino and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the North Atlantic Oscillation, what they do is they are a means to balance the heat distribution around the planet. So natural cycles move heat from north to south and from east to west and from ocean to atmosphere and back again. Natural cycles rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. They make one part of the climate system warmer at the expense of making another part cooler. So, for example, back in the medieval times, there was something that we know, those of us who come from a Western background, as the medieval warm period. The reason it was known as the medieval warm period is because it was unusually warm over the North Atlantic at that time. And using natural thermometers, tree rings, ice cores, and more, we can actually look at what global temperature was like back in medieval times. You can see that over the North Atlantic, it was indeed warmer than average, but you know what? If you lived in Siberia at that time, it was the medieval cold period. Why? Because this was the result of a natural cycle. It was moving heat around the climate system, putting a little bit more over here and a little bit less over there. On the exact same temperature scale, what does it look like today? It looks like this. Nothing like a natural cycle. Today, the entire planet is warming. The atmosphere is warming, the land surface is warming, and the ocean is warming. That's how we know it can't be a natural cycle, because it would violate conservation of energy. Where is that heat coming from? It isn't a natural cycle. Then people say, well, how do we know that it isn't the orbital cycles that put the Earth into the ice ages and the warm interglacial periods like we're in today? Well, we can calculate where we are. And in fact, I did that myself in my orbital astronomy class as an undergraduate. And according to orbital cycles, we should be slowly, gradually heading into the next ice age sometime in the next 1,500 years. And instead, we're getting warmer faster and faster. Lastly, people say, well, what about volcanoes? I've heard that one big volcanic eruption produces more pollution than all humans do in a year or 10 years or 30 years. Unfortunately, that just isn't true. Volcanic eruptions do produce a lot of sulfuric acid droplets. And as they're spewed far up into the atmosphere during a really powerful volcanic eruption, which only happens every few decades, these particles have a cooling effect, not a warming effect. They reflect the sun's energy back to space like an umbrella, and they temporarily cool the Earth down for anywhere from a few weeks to up to a year or more. Now, geologic activity, all of it, not just volcanoes, does produce some amount of heat-trapping gases, some methane, some carbon dioxide. But all of the geologic activity in the world produces the equivalent amount of heat-trapping gases to 3 medium-sized U.S. states. Nope, volcanoes have an alibi too. It really is us. Now, when I say us, what do I mean by that? How are we humans affecting something as big as the planet? We're doing it by adding to the natural blanket that our planet already has. Our planet has an amazing natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that occur naturally. Water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and more. What they do is they act as a blanket. The sun's energy shines down and hits the Earth warms up and gives off heat. And then just like a blanket traps your body heat on a cold night, in the same way this blanket of heat-trapping gases traps the Earth's heat, keeping us over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. The Earth would be a frozen ball of ice if it were not for this amazing natural blanket. So if this blanket is natural, which it is, and if it's a good thing, which it definitely is, what's the problem? The problem is we are adding to it. By digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, that's 70% of the problem, and by large-scale deforestation and industrial agriculture, that's 25% of the problem, we are producing far more heat-trapping gases than we need. And this is effectively wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. How long have we known this? You might think, oh, it's only been 20 years or 30 years. No, it's been a very long time. This natural blanket that keeps us at the perfect temperature for life was discovered by Joseph Fourier in the 1820s. By the 1850s, Eunice Foote had written a paper that was read at the American Association for the Advancement of Science's 1856 meeting, stating that if carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were higher, the planet would be warmer. John Tyndall, an Irish scientist, specifically linked coal mining to increased emissions of methane, which he called coal gas, and carbon dioxide. By the 1890s, we knew so much about physics that Svante Arrhenius, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physical chemist, in his spare time, so to speak, because that's what we scientists do in our spare time, right? In his spare time, he decided to calculate by hand how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It was the first climate model. It took him about 2 years. But by the end of the 2 years, the numbers he came up with were almost exactly the same as our most powerful supercomputers today. The science of climate change is very old. It truly is us. We've checked. And why does it matter? It matters because it affects us. We have never seen temperature changing this fast in the history of human civilization on this planet, and that's why it matters. Our civilization, our buildings, our roads, our water and energy and power systems, they were all built for a planet that no longer exists. One of the biggest ways climate change is affecting us is through what I call global weirding. What do I mean by that? Well, wherever we live, we have a pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally, a heat wave, a hurricane, a wildfire, a drought. That's just part of life on this planet. But decade by decade by decade, as the planet warms, it's almost as if climate change is sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and turning it into a 6, taking another and turning it into a 6, taking another and turning it into a 7. And all of a sudden we're saying, how could we have 3 500-year flood events in 3 years in Houston? How could we have temperatures over 118 degrees Fahrenheit in Portland, Oregon? How could these things happen? They're happening because climate change is loading the weather dice against us. Back in the 1980s, there was $1 billion weather or climate disaster on average every 4 months. Today, there is $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 3 weeks. Now, of course, some of that is because we have more people, we have more infrastructure, there's more at risk. But that cannot account for all the changes. We also know at the same time, climate change is loading the weather dice against us, and it's putting us all at risk. What's happening? We see that our heat waves are getting stronger, more intense, longer, and more damaging. We also see that wildfire is burning greater areas. What else is happening? Well, warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us today than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. And that's true for the atmospheric rivers that hit the west coast of North America as well. But when a ridge of high pressure moves over our area, which always happens naturally as well, then higher temperatures maintain and strengthen that ridge of high pressure, directing storm systems away from the area, making droughts stronger and longer as well. So if you think of our rainfall pattern as a natural variability of wet and dry, what climate change is doing is it's actually stretching it in both directions, so much so that we get whiplash. Here's one example from last October. The question is not, did climate change cause this event? Because we've always had heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, and wildfires. The question is, did climate change make it worse? And the answer to that is clearly yes. In fact, we are starting to be able to even put numbers on how much worse climate change made it. Climate change made the Western heat wave a year ago last summer at least 150 times more likely. Talk about loading the dice against us. Climate change increased the amount of precipitation that fell during Hurricane Harvey by as much as 40%. And why do we care about it? We care about it because it affects all of us. It affects our food, our homes, our safety, our economy. Climate change affects every single one of us living on this planet, but it doesn't affect us all equally. Those who are already marginalized, those who are already living in poverty, those who are living in low-income neighborhoods right here in the United States, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, they are the ones who are most vulnerable. When the crops fail, when storms destroy their home, when the water is contaminated by flood and runoff, those living in poverty are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we see this even in specific examples. When a flood occurs, in North America. It can be bad, but we have insurance. There's a National Guard. When a flood occurs in Southeast Asia, people lose everything. When a drought occurs in Texas, as did in 2011 and 2012, we lost about $12 billion in agricultural revenues. When a drought of this same magnitude occurs in Syria, which is a country that already had an internal refugee crisis, it already had a corrupt and unstable government, it already had grinding poverty, and then you added that drought on top of it, disaster, refugee crises. Over 1 million farmers had to abandon their land. Unemployment skyrocketed. Millions of people were displaced inside the country, and millions more outside the country. The drought was the same magnitude as what hit Texas, but the impacts were completely different. We can even look at hurricanes like Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew, over 5 years ago, it hit the Carolinas. It caused deaths and significant damages, but before it hit the Carolinas, it passed over Haiti. In Haiti, its impacts were devastating. Haiti already had cholera, and the flooding that resulted from the hurricane caused it to turn into an epidemic. 100,000 homes were destroyed. People's livelihoods and crops were washed away. The exact same hurricane, but the impacts were significantly different. Just looking at the comparison between higher and lower income countries, since the 1960s, climate change has increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries by as much as 25% in some cases. And those countries are the ones who have done the least to contribute to the problem. The 3.5 billion poorest people in the world have produced 7% of global emissions. The United States is responsible for just under 30% of global emissions. China is responsible for about 12% of global emissions total. The top 10 list includes the European Union, Canada, Australia, and more. Each of us has a role to play. Each of us has a contribution to make. So rather than pointing fingers at other countries and blaming each other, as I see all too often, we need to look at what we are doing here and how we can help the poorest and most vulnerable and most marginalized people right here at home again, as well as on the other side of the world, as climate change takes whatever issues they're coping with and makes them worse. The reason I care about climate change is because I believe that God has made us responsible for the well-being of every living thing on this planet. Genesis 1. I care about a changing climate because it takes poverty, hunger, lack of access to clean water or basic health care, people dying of diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2022. It takes these issues and it exacerbates them or makes them worse. I care about climate change because I believe that we are to be recognized by our love for others, as Jesus told his disciples. And how loving is it to stick our fingers in our ears and bury our heads in the metaphorical sand, so to speak, and say, it isn't real, it's not us, it isn't bad, when our sisters and our brothers are already suffering the impacts today. So if climate change is real, which it is, if it's caused by us, which it is, if it's urgent, which it absolutely is, and if it affects the poorest the most, even though it does affect all of us too, why aren't we acting? For many of us, it's because we feel like we're caught in an impasse. We don't know what to do. So what do we need to act? We need to recognize that there is a different way to live. We need to start, I believe, by being grateful for the benefits and the blessings that fossil fuels have brought us. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't like to go back and live 300 years ago. Our lifespan has doubled in the last 200 years thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which was primarily powered by fossil fuels. Electricity, transportation, refrigeration, all of the things we take for granted in this life were the result of the Industrial Revolution, and I am profoundly grateful for the benefits it brought us. But just like we no longer rely on horses or buggies or party line telephones, in the same way, it's time to transition off fossil fuels because we've gotten to the point where their side effects are much greater than their benefits. I'm not talking about flipping some magic switch today. That's impossible. We can't do that. But I am talking about accelerating the transition to clean energy. For who? For the 10 million people who die prematurely every year from the air pollution. I'm not talking about heat-trapping gases. I'm just talking about the particulates in the air pollution produced from burning fossil fuels. 10 million a year. That's double the number of premature COVID deaths every single year from air pollution from fossil fuels. I'm talking about doing it for all those low-income countries who don't have vast resources of coal or gas or oil, and that is a large reason why they are low-income countries. But they have a lot of sun, and they have a lot of wind, and they might have a lot of hydropower as well, or geothermal energy. And when we accelerate that clean energy revolution, it addresses energy poverty as well. What benefits do climate solutions bring us? Well, today, solar energy is already the cheapest source of electricity in many parts of the world, including China and India. We also know that efficiency is a big part of the solution. Through efficiency alone, we could cut our carbon emissions in half and save money. We know that smart agriculture can take carbon out of the atmosphere where we have too much of it and put it back in the soil where we want it. Restoring our ecosystems, not just tree planting, but restoring coastal wetlands, protects us from storm surge and takes up carbon too. Restoring degraded ecosystems addresses the biodiversity crisis. And it takes up carbon too. And building resilience to the impacts that are already here today, making our cities greener, reducing the urban heat island effect, ensuring that people have access to clean water and a robust power grid that can weather the storms, the floods, the hurricanes that come. All of these give us something better than what we have today. Just as climate change impacts us all, climate solutions benefit us all. How do we as Christians respond? To this, again, I believe that we can turn to the Bible. And the Bible doesn't talk about climate change, of course, but it talks a lot about our attitudes and our actions. And one of my favorite verses that I use to guide my own response to this issue is in Timothy, where Paul is writing to Timothy, and he says this. He says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. So often the dialogue and the rhetoric around climate change revolves around fear. On one side of the spectrum, you have people who are absolutely paralyzed by fear of what's going to happen if we don't address this issue. I hear from them all the time. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have people who are absolutely paralyzed by fear of what is going to happen if we do address this problem. And I hear from them all the time too. Often they're not willing to admit that there's fear. They cloak it with denial or rejection or arguments, but at the very core of it is also fear that if we address this issue, it will take away what I hold dear. If there is fear at the bottom of what we feel, it is not from God. We have a litmus test that says that God has not given us that spirit of fear, but God has given us 3 gifts that we can use. First of all, God has given us a spirit of power. Now, that's a bit of an old-fashioned word, but what that means is we have been empowered, we have agency, we are able to act. Fear often paralyzes us. God has given us the ability to act. How? In love, which means that we can consider others' needs above our own. And as a scientist, my favorite is the last part, with a sound mind, to make good decisions based on the information that He has given us. So, how do we act in love with a sound mind? In a way that I believe is profoundly biblical, by using our voices, by using the gifts God has given us as part of His body to advocate for change wherever we are. In our church, in our school, in our university, in our city, in our organization, in our place of work, saying, hey, maybe we could do an energy audit, save money, cut our carbon emissions, and use that money to support and care for people who need it. Do that with our church. Consider offering our church roof to our community as a solar panel community garden, so to speak, because it's a lot cheaper to put one big set of solar panels on one big roof than it is to put smaller sets on smaller roofs. Learn about organizations like Plant for Purpose, Tear Fund, Arasha, the Evangelical Environmental Network, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Learn about organizations that are working with people and helping people who are affected by this issue. Follow them on social media. Invite them to give a webinar or a talk to your church. Support what they do. Talk about this when we gather. There are so many things that we can do as individuals. There are so many things that we can do collectively as the body of Christ. But it all begins with using our voice to talk about why this matters and what we can do working together to make a difference. Having that conversation isn't so much about the head, it's more about the heart. It's about why we care, and it's connecting it to the hands, what we can do about it. The goal of the conversation is not to talk at people. The goal of the conversation is to bring more people into it. Because to care about climate change, we only have to be one thing. And that one thing is quite literally a human being who lives on planet Earth. And if we're a Christian, how much more so? Because I am convinced that caring about God's creation, the people and the other living things that are already being affected by climate change today, is a genuine expression of our faith. It's a faithful acceptance of our God-given responsibility, and, perhaps most importantly, it is a true expression of God's love.